you'd like.
Okay. Welcome everybody to the American Space Museum celebrating 50 years of peace in Earth orbit, the Apollo Soyuz Test Project, 50 years ago orbiting the Earth with 2 Russians and 3 Americans. And my good friend Steve Agid here is going to set it up with some of the history of that, and then we're going to have 2 legends of NASA, Mr. Jay Honeycutt and Mr. John Tribe, come up and share some of their when they were young type of experiences of this Apollo Soyuz Test Project. So important to the human relations in orbit that are going on today at the International Space Station. So I've got Matthew Raj on the board here. We got Trekkie Techie Jessica Dumont helping us today. Thank you, Jesse. And I'm going to quickly go through and set up a few slides here. Raj, go to the next one, please, that we want to show the crew. There's our crew there. Of course, the General Tom Stafford in the background and his Russian counterpart, Commander Alexei Leonov, become lifelong friends. Deke Slayton, Mercury astronaut, left bottom, finally got a ride to space. And Vance Brand is in the middle. Vance later commanded several shuttle missions. And Alexei Kubasov is that's not his first name, but it's Kubasov, I know is his last name. And Vance Brand is the only one still alive at age 94, very lucid and telling tales. Somebody that recently saw him told me, but he's not getting on airplanes and traveling anymore from his home in California. Next slide, please. Just you can quickly hit those, Raj. The iconic emblem there that was once going to be done by, this is done by Robert McCall, and it was going to be done by Paul Calley. And next slide. Just a beautiful shot by ASM partner Tom Usiak when the remote structure was pulled off of the S1B and the, depending on how you interpret it, either the milk stool or the bar stool that it sat on there. Beautiful shot 50 years ago, a couple nights ago. Next slide. There's Tom Stafford, arrived in the rain. Fixture here on the Space Coast for many years. I know Mr. Tribe and Mr. Honeycutt knew him very well. Hope they can share a story or two. And those of you that met him know he was a very important figure in not only the space program, but he's considered the father of the stealth bomber and fighter. And there is Deke and Vance arriving at Patrick Air Force Base over 50 years ago. It was in the rain, and they came separate planes. I know that brings some good memories back to you old-timers. Next. Tom Usiak's beautiful montage of the rocket launch of the last Saturn-class rocket used, and then, of course, the last capsule left from the great Apollo era. Next, please. These are the 5 official patches of the program. And the Russian patch officials on the left and the American, then a hybrid that they used, 2 hybrids there. This, of course, being in 1975. Next. And a beautiful shot again by Tommy Usiak looking up the tailpipe there of the engines of that last Apollo-class rocket to be launched. Go ahead. The handshake in space by Leonov and Stafford, historic, and today Russian and Americans are working together on the International Space Station. In fact, there's 3 Americans, 3 Russians, and 1 Japanese astronaut on our space station as we speak. Also, 3 Chinese are orbiting the Earth, for a total of 10 humans orbiting the Earth now. Next, please. And one of the beautiful renderings of the space age, I think, are of what it looked like, the cutaway drawings of all this. And it's actually Brandt was controlling the command module there as they met. And interestingly, in front of us here, we've got the model of that. But if you don't know, the Soyuz spacecraft, the astronauts were launched and returned to Earth in that middle section. In the section they're in right now is kind of an extra room for experiments. And this was the way they did it since 1967. Next, please. Another Robert McCall, gorgeous interpretation of this. We had to build the docking port that you see there, the unwieldy looking thing there. And that's a beautiful, another historical shot. Next, please. A piece of artwork, of course. This is the Paul Cali version. You're familiar with the Apollo stamp, so famous, the 10-cent stamp in 1969. And Mr. Cali designed that, and he did other things for NASA. He actually spent time in Star City with the astronauts, sketching them, a master of the HB pencil. And this was his offering, but it wasn't rejected. It was, I forget the word they officially used, but it was, they weren't into doves and olive branches, apparently. So that was what Deke had told Paul Cali about that. So that didn't become the official patch, but this is a rendition done by his son and Chris and Paul Cali. Go ahead, next please there. And to honor his dad, Chris Cali, who's a partner of the museum and a fabulous artist in his own right, wanted to do some alternate takes on his dad's interpretation of the peace dove and olive branch and the peace sign. And Chris is going to make patches out of this and offer the proceeds to support the American Space Museum. Next, please. And this is a whimsical look that his dad had after spending a lot of time with the Russians. And there his dad is on the far left, Paul Cali with his sketch pad, and everybody toasting. We've got Dewar's Scotch for the Americans, and of course Strolnia vodka on the other side there. Next. Yeah, Strolly. Again, another interpretation. Part of what we may hear about today is the building of this docking module. There was actually a separate room of its own, and then was abandoned in space. And there's a couple patches there. Sorry for the out of focus, but the Peanuts, Snoopy went to space and met the Russian bear in some of the space team goodwill that they did, using the Snoopy as the mascot of safety in NASA since Apollo 10. And out of 50 years ago come this cooperation with the American Space Museum, first with the Mir Space Station in the lower left, and then the International Space Station today. The Mir Space Station missions were during the time when Mr. Honeycutt was Kennedy Space Center director in 95 and 96. And another piece of artwork there. And we believe in science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And this is another example of why we need art. This was the interpretation before things were even off the drawing board, probably. And we don't want you to forget during today's presentation that this is July 19th and just one day away, 56 years ago, of the historic landing of Apollo 11 on the moon. And many of you in the room today and watching today were alive or even working on it. And this, again, is Mr. Chris Cali's interpretation of Gene Cernan, the last man on the moon on Apollo 17, with the mission patches there, including Apollo 1 in the upper left-hand corner there. So 56 years of the Apollo 11 moon landing. If you want to watch it, they land tomorrow afternoon, Sunday, about 4:30, which they did 56 years ago on a Sunday afternoon. And there's a website called Apollo Real Time that you can watch and match everything going on with the mission. So hope you enjoyed this introduction. Hope you enjoy the programs we have today. We feel strongly that the American Space Museum celebrates the space worker as much as the astronaut, and having these little mini forums is something we want to do frequently to get other space workers in the public eye, and also on our YouTube channel. So Steve, I want to just introduce you. Thank you very much for that. Let me do that. Let me have a final toast of Tang. That I have some Tang back there as we get our program going here. Steve Agid, by way of introduction, is an educator at the Kennedy Space Center Visitors Complex. He is also involved with the Hubble telescope. I'm not sure what kind of engineer you were, Steve.
Well, he said I was electrical engineer.
Electrical engineer, okay. So, and he has got a a program here that I'm going to turn over to him and thank him. Thank you so much for being here and helping us today, Steve.
Always enjoy it.
Take it away.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for being here today and hope you enjoy the broadcast. It is going to be something very similar to one I did at the Visitor Center just a few days ago on the 50th anniversary of the Apollo Soyuz mission. So let's begin. I'm titling it From a Cold War to a Warm Handshake. In order to do this, I'm not going to just focus on that Apollo Soyuz mission, because the most important part of the mission, to me, was what it set up. If it was just a one-time thing, it would have been nothing more than a stunt. But it got countries used to working together. We went from there to the Shuttle Mir program, and from there to the International Space Station. Now, how did this all begin? Well, you got to go very, very far back, all the way to the very beginning. And that was when the space race began, October 4th, 1957. Now, on America's TV sets, that day was very special because a new television program premiered for the first time. It was called Leave It to Beaver. So if you remember that show, it premiered on October the 4th, 1957. Now, in America, this came as a terrible shock. The Second World War was just over 12 years ago. The Russians we knew were not very technically competent. We had all these thoughts about how that government worked, and they could never beat us in anything. And all of a sudden now, we have this Soviet satellite circling over the Earth. So this was an incredible shock. So one of the things I decided to bring here is a book that was printed right after that. It was called What Ivan Knows That Johnny Doesn't. There was an incredible concern, and I'm just going to show it here to the members of the audience here. There was a big concern that America might be number 2 in the world. How do you compare the educational systems in Russia with those of the United States? And the people writing the book did the research. One of the things they learned is the average American child in what we would call the 4th grade knows how to read about 1,500 words. The average Russian child in what would be the 4th grade knows about 10,000 words. What the American children learned to read on, they used to call them the Alice and Jerry books, which were replaced later by the Dick and Jane books. But the Russians would start reading their actual authors, like Tolstoy. So there's a very big concern that we are far below what the Russians may be. Now, how did that change things? Well, it changed it like this. There was something called the National Defense Education Act that was passed in 1958. We have to start doing things that now we consider STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. Allocate a lot of money in order to get students that don't have access to a good education to have a good education. That program was about $1 billion. Today, $1 billion isn't very much, but at the time, the entire budget of the United States was just $73 billion. So it was a significant part of the budget at that time. Now, we went even further back when 1961 came. At that time, we were getting our Mercury astronauts ready to fly, but just about a month before our flight, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. That was on April the 12th of 1961. And worse, not only was he the first man and a Russian, but he orbited the Earth. Our first plan is to send someone up on a suborbital flight, just about 15 minutes in duration. So again, the Russians have this lead. We are questioning what we're doing. When we had the first American launched after Sputnik and Sputnik 2, which had a dog in space, our first rocket was a Vanguard that just got about 3 feet off the pad before it exploded. And it was done worse in front of the eyes of the world. Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, proposed that they have an aid program to consider the United States one of the backward nations to give them aid. So there is an intense rivalry between our two nations. Well, the Mercury program, John Glenn finally got us into orbit in 1962. We fell further behind yet again back in 1965 when Alexei Leonov became the first person to walk in space. Again, a Russian, and again before us. Discussions were made in Houston, changing the flight order a little bit, so Gemini 4 astronaut Ed White would follow up in June. So now we were pretty much tied in space. So this rivalry was a big concern, and it has lasted, at this point, almost an entire decade. But then there's an old expression that says space is hard. You're going to see how hard it is when we go to the next slide. 1967 was a very pivotal year. It began in tragedy. On January 27th of 1967, the first Apollo crew, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were killed during a countdown test on January 27th of 1967. Across the Great Sea, on April 24th, the very first Soyuz mission, Soyuz 1, killed cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. So now both countries have suffered a space tragedy. A little bit of walking back, learning that we need to take good care and watch our missions. So America will get ready to go into space yet again. Now, the space race continued, but it culminated about 56 years ago with the launch and landing of Apollo 11. There was no question at this point that we had overtaken the Soviet technology. Well, now that was what was considered the space race is done, NASA's looked back and said, well, now that we could officially say that this skirmish in space is over, what could we do, perhaps together? And so discussions were laid for what would become Apollo Soyuz. Let's go to the next slide. So in October of 1970, just about a year after the Apollo 11 moon mission, the man in charge, the administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Tom Paine, connects with Gelyush, who was the president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Can we come up with an idea of how we can combine our resources to perhaps work together in space, do some sort of a mission? And that becomes the idea. And what they decided to do is start a series of meetings. How would you get to work together? And they formed several working groups. Working Group 0 was the overall technical management of the program. How are we going to get these two groups of engineers from these two different rival countries to work together? Working Group 1 will develop how will we understand how will this mission proceed? What will we do in what order? Working Group number 2 will discuss emergency situations. Number 3 would work on the mechanical design. Our spacecraft were obviously never made to connect to each other. How would we be able to develop the technical aspects of this mission? How would we actually transfer between the vehicles? And then finally, the life support issues that we would need. Let's continue. Now, this is just one of the critical slides. You tend to think that all engineers think alike. Well, all American engineers might think alike, but these are people in very different environments. How we designed our spacecraft was very different. Let's take a look. In the flight control systems, the Soviets were automatic. The American systems were manual. If a primary system failed, the Russian idea was you just go back to Earth. The American system, we had backup systems that we would use. Well, the human risks are eliminated by the Soviets using their designs to eliminate by minimizing the amount of errors you could make. The Americans highly trained their crew to get around these difficult problems. In Russia, we control the spacecraft from the ground. In America, the crew controls its spacecraft in flight. The spacecraft designs in Russia are more simple, ours are more complex. Even the atmosphere that you breathe in space, the Russians use a very similar to Earth atmosphere, 80% nitrogen, 20% oxygen at 14.7 pounds per square inch, just like you're breathing right now, where the Americans use 100% oxygen at much lower pressure of 5 pounds per square inch. The documents needed for the mission, well, the Russians are very secretive, very restrictive. The Americans, everything's available to the public. So all these general problems are going to unfold time after time again when we have every kind of technical discussion, because everything is so different in the way we face these programs. Let's continue. Now, one of the other difficult things, there are the mechanical issues, personal issues, but then there's the world at large. Not only are you making this spacecraft with other engineers, there's the whole world that's proceeding along with you. How do you work with these people day to day when the world is going on outside your window? So let's take a look. We start this in 1970. The big story is Apollo 13 narrowly missing a disaster. The Vietnam War is going to continue throughout this time, from 1970 through 1975, and America and the Soviet Union are on different sides. There are show trials for the Jews trying to leave Russia. That becomes a very big issue. The Soviet Soyuz 11 crew of 3 died when their spacecraft lost pressure on reentry. In Apollo 17, we had our last lunar landing in 1972. We had several Skylab missions, 3 missions from 1973 and 4. There was the Yom Kippur War between Israel, Egypt, and Syria. And again, we supported different sides. And while all this is going on, we're still concentrating on getting this mission done. Now, we had a Soviet launch failure in 1975, very shortly before the Apollo Soyuz mission. The crew survived. The Angola Civil War was going on. And again, we're on different sides. So while those things are occurring on Earth, our engineers and technicians on both sides are working together to continue with the Apollo Soyuz program. So we start a series of meetings. The very first one was in 1970. I only outlined a few of these in green. When you and I tend to think of a meeting, we say, well, let's get together next Tuesday at 3 o'clock. When these guys did a meeting, it wasn't really a meeting. It was more like a series of meetings, some of them lasting over 2 months, but it still counted as one meeting. So the very first one you see there, for those of you at home, you can stop and freeze this to give you an idea of what's going on in each of the different meetings. It's the very first meeting. We have never been to the Russian control centers before. They have never been to our control centers before. We've never seen the Soviet technology up close. Now we're going to get to see it up close. So meeting after meeting is held. On the charts there, for the folks that are listening here at the American Space Museum, the parentheses shows how many days those meetings lasted. Now, in 1972, after about 1.5 years of discussions, we had an agreement signed between President Nixon of the United States and Premier Kosygin of the Soviet Union that we're going to have peaceful cooperation in space. And as you'll see in the next slide, we signed the agreement, and part of the agreement is going to be to conduct the joint mission. Let's go to the next slide. That's the official document. Now, what I'm going to do on the slide following that, it is the first trip of an American president to the Soviet Union. That has never happened before. In the next slide, I outline one little part of that document. It says, it is planned for the first experimental flight to test these systems be conducted during 1975, envisioning a docking of a United States Apollo spacecraft and a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft with visits of astronauts in each other's spacecraft. So that's the agreement in 1972. It's all official. Now all we have to do is work to make it happen. We have a crew selection, as you've heard before. Deke Slayton, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, is in the crew. Tom Stafford will be the commander. Vance Brand, the only one of the crew that has not flown before. And then Alexei Leonov, who made the first spacewalk in space, and Valery Kubasov will be the Soviet crew members. Next slide. Now, we had never become familiar with the Russian spacecraft before. So this is just some of the ideas of some of the different systems they have compared to what we would use. A lot of different antenna systems. Let's go to the next slide. Different angles that we had. Something we had to learn about that Soviet system. We knew the Apollo systems. They had to learn about the Apollo systems. We had to learn about the Russian systems. And the final view, the view that we would get when we got to dock with that mission. Let's continue. And by transfer, we showed them our Apollo spacecraft. Now, we had to modify that Apollo spacecraft for this mission as well. because if you want to talk to the Russians, you have to talk on the same radio frequencies. They have to use some of the equipment that we would normally be using to communicate with our communications satellites. The TDRS network of satellites we depend on today was not there. We had something called ATS-6, the Application Technology Satellite. We would use that as part of the mission. The Russians obviously were never intended to communicate with that craft either. So we made a lot of changes to the Apollo spacecraft. We added recorders. We had a different control panel to operate the new switches for this new, if you could look at the picture here, or I should say the model, this docking adapter, because again, Apollo was never designed to connect to a Russian vehicle. Continue. And that is the docking module. It's about 10 feet long. And that is how we will transfer between an Apollo spacecraft. From this view, the Apollo spacecraft would be on the right-hand side. The Russian Soyuz would be connecting on the left-hand side. Again, that is a drawing that we saw earlier today, and that is what it was supposed to look like for that docking that would occur over the Earth. Now, this will just be a continuation of all those different meetings, some of them in Moscow, some of them in Houston, and including meetings that were actually at the Soviet launch site at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. And these are going on year after year. And again, some of these missions, at the second to the bottom, a mission, or I should say a meeting that went from July 1st through September 5th, 67 days. And that was testing on that docking system. Continuing. And finally, the 50th meeting, if we can move to the next slide, was actually in Earth orbit. So that worked out pretty well. And that was from July 17th to 19th. It was lasted about 2 full days, about 48 hours in space. Now, just to give you an idea of how that communications would be handled, if you look at the lower left corner, you see the Space Flight Tracking and Data Network, STDN. The Soviets never communicate with that control center. And the Application Technology Satellite there on the far left side as well. So everyone's learning about the different frequencies and everything we had to do to modify these vehicles, modify the Russian vehicles, just so we'd be able to communicate with each other during the flight. Have Russian people in our control center, American people in their control center. And you can see the ground system here. We have our Araya aircraft. You can see that in the lower half left-hand corner, the Apollo Range Instrumentation aircraft, the tracking ships like the Vanguard is out there, the Goldstone Network, Hawaii, all the tracking stations, and the Russian ones with the red stars. So as we're in orbit, we're getting ready for that meeting on the 17th of July. Picture of the Soviet Soyuz coming towards us, and the next shot, the view that they have of the Apollo spacecraft coming towards them. Now, this is one of those interesting historical ironies. The spacecraft, you can see, is going to be connecting over the Elbe River. Now, in 1945, on April 25th, the American General Reinhardt met Soviet General Rusakov. Reinhardt's leading the 69th American Infantry, the Russians the 58th Russian Infantry. They meet at that same location. The first thing they do is shake hands, and here we are, some 30 years later, right above, shaking hands yet again. So again, one of the questions I had is, was this a nice little plan to do that? How symbolic? The answer is no. It turned out to be just a coincidence. They just happened to be over that spot. And this is that famous handshake in space that you saw a little bit earlier. Now, it just wasn't a symbolic get-together, have a handshake, exchange meals. There actually were science experiments that were conducted on board both the American spacecraft and the Russian spacecraft, and some that were actually done with the cooperation of both. One was an astronomy experiment, and what the American spacecraft had to do is go out about 650 feet away from Soyuz and go directly in front of the sun. So you'd actually see the solar corona that we would normally only see during an eclipse, and try to do measurements. unfortunately, that experiment did not work. The American spacecraft, the thrusters moving, affected the data that they received. But several of the other experiments in material sciences and Earth resources did work. Now, that was in 1975. There was no immediate follow-on. That's very sad, but the world events continued on. So we're going to look at what was going on between then and the next time we got together. 1976, the big story was the American bicentennial. Everything was bicentennial. The Iran hostage crisis in 79. First shuttle launch in 81, followed by the Falkland War in 82. The Bhopal gas tragedy was the big story in 1984 with up to 20,000 dead. AIDS came on the scene in 1985. The Challenger and Chernobyl accidents in 1986. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the Soviet Union itself in 1991, and in 1994, the big story was the O.J. Simpson trial. And while all of this is going on, President Clinton announced that we would try to get together with the Russians and have a joint program, have them part of a new program called the International Space Station Program. Now, the situation was this. Originally, we were going to build a space station called Freedom. That was put on the shelf. We would go with an international space station. But the problem with that was we don't have that much experience in long-duration spaceflight. Our longest flight was the third Skylab mission. In that mission, we were in space for 84 days. The Russians launched their big space station called Mir. That first launch was in 1986, so they've been flying 6 months at a time on their space station. We needed to have more experience in space in long-duration flights, and the Russians needed money. So the idea is, if we work together, we'll send our astronauts to the Russian station using a Russian rocket. The Russians will send their cosmonauts to that station using an American space shuttle. And then our astronauts would live on that Russian station for about 6 months at a time. And we would do that 9 times. And so the Shuttle Mir program began. Let's continue. That is the Russian space station Mir. Now, I was way too young to be involved in Apollo Soyuz. However, I was right in the middle of the Shuttle Mir program. Let's continue on. We had a meeting up there at the top left-hand side. This is our ground team processing. Now, for Apollo Soyuz, we made the docking system here in the United States. For the Mir docking system, that's that orange device you see right there, that was made in Russia. So in June of 1995, it was flown to the United States. And so here we were, a Russian aircraft landing here at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, something that doesn't happen every day. Get that spacecraft here, working with those Russian engineers for several months. Now, if we can go back again to the last slide. On the, next one. There we go. On the upper right, you can see one of the tests we did. If you have good eyes towards the upper right, we're on the edge of the payload bay of the orbiter there. I'm there on the lower left-hand corner of that. My quality engineer above me, the 3 people next to me, the girl in the middle was our Russian translator. The Russian engineer and Russian quality person are there. We're directing a test to make sure that this Russian module is working with our American space shuttle. On the lower left, we were getting ready to close the payload bay doors of the shuttle. And finally, when everything worked, at the very bottom on the right, this is the American and Russian team getting awards for the work we did on this mission. That is a mission STS-74, which brought this Russian piece to the Mir space station. And the next slide will show you that piece connected to Mir. Now, from now on, the American space shuttle would connect to the lower part of that section, and we would be able to get our astronauts on board the Mir space station, live for 6 months. Another shuttle would pick them up, and they'd come back down to Earth. Now, we had 9 of those shuttle Mir flights. Again, each of those for about 6 months apiece. The last of these, shuttle mission STS-91. Continuing on, and now that we've learned to work with these Russians, learned how they work, they learned how we worked, working these things out together, we continue to build the International Space Station. Now, since November 2nd of the year 2000, we have been living together in space. We might have had problems on Earth, but in space, we're living together. Right now, we're in the middle of Space Station Mission 73. So there's been 73 what we call expeditions to that space station. And again, as Mark mentioned earlier today, we have 3 Americans, 3 Russians, and 1 Japanese astronaut on board. And finally, in summary, the International Space Station has been continuously in orbit with a crew since November 2nd of the year 2000. That's 9,025 days. But it all began with the Apollo Soyuz mission that was launched 50 years ago this week. Okay, Mark, I think that pretty much wraps it up for me.
Yep,
If
Steve,
anybody have any
wow.
questions.
Good job, buddy. That was a quick, thank you so much. Quick lesson. Liked your charts. I think a gentleman next will be addressing maybe some of the highlights of those charts. Any questions for Steve? Yes, sir.
Steve, what was the paperwork like when you were working with the Russians? How many signatures did you get?
Yeah, the paperwork, there was a lot of interesting things about the Russians. One of the things when I got assigned to Mir, I know General Patton once said, you never want to fight for the same real estate twice. So one of the first things I did was find out everything we learned from Apollo Soyuz. And one of the things that we joked about was the Russians, Alexei Leonov said that there were 3 languages that were used. 3. What are they? He said, well, they had Russian, they had American, and they had Oklahomsky. That was Tom Stafford. And so I figured out that they said they developed their own little languages, which words translate a lot better. So when we looked at some of the paperwork, we would go through the thing. We had our translators look back. As we went through the steps, procedure after procedure, we'd say what we were going to do. They'd have the translator translating it. I remember one step in particular. A step in English says, turn this off. In the Russian procedure, it said, turn it on. So that was a big test hole right there. I'll tell you another funny little story, just to give you an idea. They talked about language problems, and some of them were very, very funny. We understand words in English very well because we're English. If you're listening to another tongue, it's a little tougher. And one of the ones that Leonov talked about is the word maneuver. You know, you're flying in space. Maneuver is one of the words you're going to use, and you're going to use it a lot. It's very hard in Russian, apparently, to detect the difference between maneuver and manua. Think about that. So when we were doing docking connections, if you remember in the high bay, we were doing the connections, and the word for connector in Russian is very, very hard. So I suggested we use the word zhenat, which is married. So they hold up 2 connectors, and I would say zhenat, connect them or marry them, or ne zhenat, don't marry them. And we're going through the procedure, and we're just whizzing this thing by. And that was great. I said, we're going to do it the same way when we get to the shuttle. Unfortunately, you know, in the shuttle, you're actually in that launch control center, and we have about 300 people there. So they're holding up the connectors, zhenat, zhenat, ne zhenat, zhenat, zhenat. And all of a sudden, the Russians, not familiar with our little code sequence, are saying, this guy shouldn't be talking about his marital problem. You know, should I get married, not get married, not get married? So a lot of these things, you know, turn out to be pretty funny. So with the paperwork, we did have a secretary, George Fienza, who was the boss there at McDonnell Douglas, who spoke fluent Russian. So she went through a lot of the paperwork. But everything had to be, the words we use, for example, you know what we would call a man lift for Florida Power and Light, those devices that pick you up. Sometimes we call them a scissors lift. Sometimes they call them a man lift. Sometimes we call them a high lift. So I tried to explain to the Russians what we were trying to do. If you had a picture, that's great. If you don't, and they said, well, we wouldn't use that word. I said, what word do you use? We said, well, you tell somebody to get them a cradle. For a cradle for an American is something you put a baby in. You tell them, you know, you tell a Russian that, oh, we're going to do something there, or we'll put you in a cradle. Sounds like you're treating them as a baby. So that was just some of the words. So we had to translate a lot of these words on what they would call the same device that we would be using. So trying to put that in the paperwork. Okay, anybody else?
Got another question for Steve Agid here. I do, and you've been a communicator a long time and been on the scene, so to speak. Have you met any of these? You have any personal encounters with any of these astronauts?
Yeah,
to
I
talk
got
about?
to meet Alexei Leonov. He was here in 1995 for the 20th anniversary. So I got to meet and speak with him a little bit. Again, he did speak English. And Tom Stafford, met him, and Vance Brand. Vance Brand and I are exactly 21 years apart.
Oh, okay.
He was
Born on what
on
day?
May 9th.
May 9th.
Yep.
All right,
And,
Vance just turned 94.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we just, that's right, because I'm 73. So there you do the math. But, and it's interesting, and Leonov's artwork, when I met him, they were putting a new book together called In the Stream of Stars. And I knew one of the American artists and introduced him to Alexei. And it was great because they were able to just compare their artworks and such. It was just wonderful having these people talk together about what space meant to them.
Great. Some of the side notes of Apollo Soyuz that I've picked up and known, of course, through the museum is, of course, Alexei and Tom become great friends. Tom died 2 years ago, about a year ago in March, and Alexei a couple years ago. And Stafford went to Red Square and gave his eulogy in Russian, okay? And there were some really dramatic pictures, quite a state funeral for Alexei Leonov, of course, the first human to leave a spaceship. And just when you see them together, you just see by the pictures they're having a good time. They hunted together, did all kinds of things together. And I've been privileged to meet Mr. Stafford several times. Like I said, he's was a fixture here on the Space Coast and did a lot of great things for the American Space Museum. One of the memorabilia things we have a February 8th, 1975 dinner. And it doesn't say where this dinner was at. One of you guys might remember. And it's just filled with, there's Leonov's autograph over here. I see Alan Bean, Moonwalker on the back here, his distinctive autograph. See Vance Brand's over here. Some astronauts are hard to figure out. You know, you gotta, the way they write their name there. But yeah, you might want to walk up and check that out here after our program today. But and I hope you check out our in our gallery a special ASTP exhibit that we put together over here on the back wall with some things loaned to us and other things we have. Some of them from Ken Havicott, a great collector of space memorabilia and so forth. So, yeah, any other questions? We'll appreciate that, Steve. Thank you very much. We're going to turn off at the moment and then reset right at 2 o'clock for Mr. Jay Honeycutt and Mr. John Tribe. So take a break, get you a little tang maybe. Sorry it's hot in this room, but we're going to solve that with more donations to our nonprofit one day. So take a little break, and we'll be back sharply here in 5 minutes to set up and get ready to go live at 2 o'clock. Thank you for watching on YouTube, and thank you for supporting the American Space Museum on what we call today Peace in Earth Orbit, 50 years later. Thank you.